Good morning, YouTube. Tire Metalhead Weatherman here. Hopefully you guys are doing well. In this one, we are going to be taking a look at the June outlook. Video has been a little bit late due to the fact that we've had so much severe weather lately. I've had my hands full covering that, and then also the tropics, as we are now getting into hurricane season for the Atlantic. Pacific, we're already in there as well, but things are pretty calm over there right now. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into things with the outlook here. One thing I want to say, though, before I do that, is also the fact that we need to make sure that we're understanding of the fact that we're looking at a 30-day average outlook. This is not what you're going to be seeing every day. So just because you're in an above or below average temperature area with high confidence, it does not mean that every day you're going to be 30 degrees above average or 50 degrees below average. So that being said, let's go ahead and get into the video here. Also, the same thing goes for the precip too. But interesting pattern that's taken shape here. We're mainly going to be seeing above average temperatures towards the northwest and pretty much the entire northern tier of the country just about. We've been seeing that trend existing across the northwest for a little bit here, and it's been really dry in particular across the northern tier of the U.S., especially west of the Great Lakes here. There's been a little bit of a ridge that's set up here. We're in a really weird wind pattern. I want to say it's an omega block, but it's really not. I don't know if there's like a name for this or something, but it's an interesting setup to say the least, because if it was a full omega block, we would probably not even be seeing severe weather like we've been seeing it across Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, etc. So I'm not sure what the name for this pattern would be, but it's definitely an interesting one to say the least. But overall, though, most of the northern tier of the country is going to be above average. Towards the desert southwest, interestingly enough, we're dealing with below average temperatures there. And then, of course, towards the Gulf Coast states, we're dealing with a slight chance of above average temperatures. Florida Peninsula being probably the greatest chance of having above average temperatures out of that region. We don't normally talk about Alaska here, but I'm going to try to start getting into that more. But overall, though, across that state, we have above average temperatures toward the northern region, and then towards the southern region, interestingly enough, we're below average. Partially due to the way the jet stream is set up here. So, like I said, it's a really interesting pattern. A lot of places that aren't used to seeing below average temperatures, like during this time of year across the desert southwest, we're already getting into the 90s, triple digits, no problem. But we're staying relatively cool here, actually, if I were to say so myself. Even across my area in Atlanta, for example, I mean, we're getting 80s, but we're not getting into 90s, because I remember this time last year it was a much different story. I'm honestly quite thankful for that because I work outside. Anyway, enough useless rambling. Let's go ahead and get into the precip outlook. Over towards the Rockies is where the greatest chance of above average precipitation exists, but increased chances do stretch all the way into the southern plains and throughout even parts of the northwest. Despite it being above average, there's still a trough that sets itself up over across this region, so it increases rain chances. That plus most likely going to be some onshore flow for these areas, especially over towards Washington and Oregon here. The driest area, of course, as I mentioned before, is mainly going to be over towards the western half of the Great Lakes and areas a little further off to the west. We have ridging that seems to be going on across this region, but interestingly enough, when we get towards the northeast, we seem to have this little stream of I don't really know what to make of them. It's almost like they try to be cutoff lows, but they end up kind of moving in a weird direction. I'm going to show you that on the model runs in just a little bit here, but you'll see what I'm talking about. I'm not really quite sure what to make of it. I have to look up that phenomenon, actually. Of course, with it being tropical season, and of course any cold fronts that come through on the southern fringes of it, we have to watch for any activity in the Gulf. This also could include the chance of creating additional showers and thunderstorms across Florida, hence why we have the above average precip set up over here. Towards Alaska, Towards the heart of the state, we're looking like we're going to be dealing with below average chances of precip, and towards the southern half, where the trough is set up, we could see an increase in precipitation. That being said, if we were to look at the 6 to 10 day outlooks and the 8 to 14 day outlooks, we can pretty much get an idea of what to expect over the next few days here. Pattern looks to get a little bit more active as we go from the 9th and towards the 13th here. Below average temperatures expected across the southeast here. I'm going to click this so that way you can get a better view if I can. Okay, there we go. But across the board here, across the eastern half of the country, good chance of below average temperatures. Florida, of course, stays warm. Southern Texas stays above average, but large area over here where we have a strong little pool of cooled air that's developed here over towards Arizona and parts of the western plains here. Above average temperatures remain dominant across the northwest and even parts of the northern tier of the U.S., especially the northern plains. Of course, coinciding with this would be Alaska having its northern tiers looking like they're going to have above average temperatures, and their below average temperatures existing across the southern half. Precip is a pretty similar look here. So across the board, western half of the country is more active. Eastern half of the country is a little bit more so towards average. Northeastern part seems to be the most active area across the eastern part of the country. And then, of course, west of the Great Lakes is where we're dealing with the decreased amount of precipitation here. Also, let's make sure we're making note of Alaska here, since I don't really get too much access to that state right now, or really no need to at the moment. We got above average precip expected across the entire state. So across the board within the next week, things are going to be interesting. There's going to be a lot of moving around with the upper level wind pattern, and as a result, weather might look a little bit different here. The 8 to 14 day outlook, it's not too different. We're looking at what I guess would be a little bit more of a negative PNA type pattern. But interestingly enough, we do see still see a good chunk of cold air across the eastern half of the country too. With a classic negative PNA setup, you would see a little bit more warm air, I would think, but I think we could be building towards that here. Of course, towards the northwest, we're still above average, and we're seeing an increase of above average temperature probability over towards the Gulf Coast states, and even starting to stretch a little bit further north into the southern reaches of the U.S. here. Pretty similar deal, and it looks like we're starting to see a little bit more cold air take over from the southern end of Alaska here. Northern end is still a little bit above average, but the confidence decreases just slightly here. With precip, it's a pretty similar deal. That little shield does stretch a little bit further. We're starting to reach into the southeast, the Ohio Valley, Tennessee valleys here. And we're starting to average out a little bit more towards the northeast mid-Atlantic. Other than that, not too much different here. West of the Great Lakes, again, below average precip possible there. And then pretty similar look for Alaska, where we're seeing just slightly above average chance of precip here. So in order to see what the numbers look like for the entire month here, we're going to go ahead and look at the temperature anomaly, and then we'll also look at precip anomaly here. I'm going to move this back. This first week could be pretty cold here across the eastern half of the country, especially towards the northeast and mid-Atlantic. This is looking towards June 10th, which would be next week. And then, of course, towards the western plains, we have this little pool of below average temperatures here. Interestingly enough, we are seeing a good contrast right here, so I'm a little bit leery of a point of severe weather being possible here. If all parameters come together, moisture, etc., that could be interesting. That's going to be a video to be made later down the line here. So let's go to week 2 here, because I'm looking at it from a weekly perspective. This is more so averages, though. I want you to also keep that in mind. That cold air does push a little bit further northward we do see some warm air starting to push back into Texas here in particular. So, like I said, there could be a couple more flashpoints here to keep a close eye on as we're looking towards June 17th here. And then even could be a couple of flashpoints here towards the Ozarks. Again, this is all dependent on other parameters coming into play. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. But it's something that's not necessarily gotten me leery, but it's something that's kind of piqued my interest just a little bit. But also, let's go towards the 24th. Now we're starting to switch into a more classic negative PNA setup. Cool air is starting to persist over towards the west, and warmer air is starting to push towards the eastern half of the country. And then as we head towards July 1st, which would pretty much symbolize the end of June, we're starting to get above average temperatures across the eastern half of the country. Below average temperatures are kind of fading for now, but as a whole, though, for the most part, this month looks like it's going to be relatively below average for a large portion of us. How much could we be looking at? Keep in mind that this is in Celsius, so I'm not going to necessarily go into the whole formula thing because it would probably result in this video being like an hour long. But anywhere where you see these dark blues, you could see probably about 3 to potentially even 4 degrees Celsius below average here. Once you get into these purple colors, it could be even cooler than that. Most of this seems to be north of the border, but there are a couple of pockets here. And I'll put it to you like this. Usually about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius is a pretty big difference. That could be about 10 to 15 degrees sometimes. I might have the math wrong. Don't quote me on it, because I'm trying to think of it off the top of my head here. I think it's actually about maybe 5 to 15 degrees, I would say. The darker the colors, more solid the colors, the higher the contrast here. But up in some of these regions here, we could be up to maybe 15, maybe even 25, even 30 degrees Fahrenheit above average. So it's one thing to also keep a note of, especially as we go into the next week in particular. It's going to be a pretty wacky week up ahead. We start to look like we mellow out a little bit more as we get later into the month, and pretty much even towards the end of the month right now. Like I said, it's still pretty far out, so a lot of things can change. So these outlooks, you have to take those with a pinch of salt, really, at this point. So I'm going to show you quickly just what the wind pattern looks like here. I'm not going to really get in too far with the into it heavily with the whole technical thing, but I'm just showing you what we're looking at right now. This is the most recent GFS model run. You can see the ridging going on right here, and this is why this part of the country is still has been pretty dry, whereas we have a little bit of a trough going on right here, hence why there's been so much cold air that's been persistent across the Northeast in comparison. So as a whole, when we move this forward here, I want you to see the flow of everything. Ridging goes all the way north of the border here. So this sector right here is going to be a little bit quieter as a result. When you see the trough, that's when you see a chance for more active weather, colder air coming in. You can see warm air really rise with these ridges here. But look what happens here as time goes on. This could result in an increase in weather over here towards the western plains. Not a strong trough, not super worried about severe weather on the 6th at the moment. But towards the 9th and after that point, things get a little bit more interesting. Also want to note that look at what happens with this ridge. It starts to shoot a little bit more towards the northwest here. Meanwhile, towards the eastern half of the country, that trough, seems to deepen just a little bit. So that cold air pushes a little bit further to the south. Then as time goes on here, we see that ridge starting to move once more. Ridge actually looks like it deepens a little bit over here based off of these little isobars here. It's not a super strong ridge, but it's strong enough. And then interestingly enough, look at this trough that tries to develop here towards the middle of the month. That could become an interesting feature here because that could influence severe weather potential as we look towards the middle of the month. And it's a very strong trough nonetheless too. So we need to keep an eye on the middle of the month for severe weather potential. We could see multiple rounds throughout the course of the month here. Of course, like I said before, that this is pretty far out, but nonetheless, some very interesting stuff could be happening this month. Of course, I'll be here to cover as much of it as I can. It's going to be a little tougher since I'm in a really active period at work, so I can't guarantee that I'll be able to go live for every event, but I'm going to try. That being said here, I hope you enjoyed this video. It's a wrap for me for right now. Make sure you are smashing that like button. Make sure you're getting that bell on, and make sure you're notified of every video that goes up every time I go live. And then, of course, hit that subscribe button and that share button too. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. This has been Tyler Metalhead Weatherman. You guys take care and have a good day.